Imagine this. You spend your entire life inside a system built on the ownership of other human beings. You hate it, you benefit from it, and you tell yourself you have no choice but to follow its rules. Then on your deathbed you sign one final document thinking it might redeem even a tiny part of what you've done, but instead that single act almost gets the man you love lynched, your daughter hunted across state lines, and your own son turned into the furious executor of your downfall because a plantation mistress in South Carolina didn't leave her wealth to her respectable white son. No, she left everything, the house, the land, the money, the family legacy, to a man the law listed as her property. A man recorded not by name but as item number 27. Her son received nothing at all, not a dollar, not an acre, not even a trinket to remember her by. This isn't a romance. This is a story about power, guilt, exploitation, and an attempt at redemption that arrived far too late. Welcome to Noctivox Dark Stories. I'm your host, and here we walk straight into the shadows of history. The buried scandals, the erased testimonies, the truths that polite society quietly shoved into locked drawers. If you're drawn to historical darkness that exposes the human heart at its most conflicted and dangerous, make sure you subscribe. Tap that notification bell and join me as we step deeper into the places most people refuse to look. Because tonight we're opening a file Charleston society desperately tried to forget. A case so dangerous, so humiliating to the social order that even whispering it in polite company could end reputations overnight. A mistress who defied every rule of Southern respectability, a son whose inheritance vanished in a single legal stroke, and a man who went overnight from being legally owned to becoming the most controversial beneficiary in South Carolina. So, before we begin, ask yourself this. Was she a monster, a victim, or something trapped and twisted into both? Our story begins not with drama, but with an object so ordinary it almost feels anticlimactic. A sealed envelope sitting quietly on a dusty wooden desk. It had been waiting there for exactly 3 weeks, untouched by the probate clerk who had strict instructions not to open it before the appointed day. 3 silent weeks for a time bomb of ink and signatures to sit still, holding a secret that would tear a family apart and shake the social foundations of Charleston. But on that morning in 1854, the clerk finally broke the seal, unfolded the papers, and felt the world tilt as he read the words inside. Because this was no ordinary will. This was a declaration that defied law, custom, race, bloodline, and every unwritten rule of the antebellum South. And it all began with a single sentence that stunned the room into silence. In the spring of 1854, a Charleston probate clerk opened a sealed envelope that had been sitting in his office for exactly 3 weeks per the instructions written on its exterior. Ashwood Plantation was not a modest inheritance. It was a kingdom carved out of 2,300 acres of rice fields, timber, marshland, and the kind of wealth that defined an entire family's place in Charleston society. The will stated, in language so calm it bordered on surreal, that every acre of Ashwood, the Charleston townhouse overlooking Meeting Street, the investment portfolio, the furniture imported from England, the silver, the jewelry, every last piece of the Whitmore legacy, was left to Marcus, not Marcus Whitmore, not Marcus, trusted steward, but Marcus, item number 27, enslaved since the age of 9, legally considered property, a man whose name appeared in ledgers between livestock tallies and tool inventories. And beside that shocking declaration came an even more devastating line. Jonathan Whitmore, the only legitimate son, the presumed heir to generations of wealth, received nothing at all. The courtroom air froze as Prescott read the clauses, his voice steady while Jonathan's future collapsed in front of him. How could a white mistress leave her fortune to a black man she legally owned? What did it mean that she overlooked her son, a man with education, status, and lineage, for someone society insisted was incapable of legal decision-making? What relationship had existed behind the walls of Ashwood that could justify such a radical act? Was it gratitude? Was it rebellion against her own society? Or was it something far more dangerous? Power mixing with desire in a way that both law and morality refused to acknowledge? This will didn't just divide property. It exposed a truth Charleston had spent generations pretending did not exist. That the lines between owner and owned were often crossed in the shadows, and crossing them produced consequences no one wanted to face. Before we go deeper into the scandal behind these pages and the questions they forced the South to confront, make sure you're subscribed to Noctivox Dark Stories. Here we unearth the histories people tried their hardest to bury, and this case is one of the most violently erased of them all. Now imagine the moment after the will was read. Jonathan staring forward, stunned, humiliated, already calculating how quickly he could contest this insult to his bloodline. Marcus somewhere outside, unaware that his world had just been rewritten in ink, unaware that freedom, wealth and mortal danger were about to collide around him, and Charleston society whispering, speculating, and preparing for a scandal that would ripple far beyond the Whitmore family. Because the moment this will surfaced, the old order cracked, and everyone felt the fracture. Eleanor Catherine Bradford entered marriage the way most young Southern women were expected to, well-trained, well-mannered, and well aware that her value in society rested on how perfectly she played the role of a plantation mistress. When she married Thomas Whitmore at 19, she stepped into an old low-country dynasty where appearances mattered more than happiness, and where duty, obedience, and quiet endurance were considered virtues. Her responsibilities were endless: managing the household, directing the domestic enslaved workers, hosting dinners, attending church, embroidering, accounting, and she fulfilled each task with the precision expected of a Whitmore wife. But beneath the surface, her marriage eroded one piece of her spirit at a time, as Thomas's frustrations, ambitions, and disappointments slowly transformed into a corrosive cruelty that left no bruises but inflicted deeper wounds than any blow could mark. He drank in private until the whiskey sharpened his tongue, criticizing her management, mocking her conversations, belittling her attempts to connect, and treating her gentle son Jonathan as a failure he could not mold into his image. Eleanor learned to shrink inside her own home, to read the temperature of Thomas's moods like a seasoned sailor watching the sky for storms, and to accept that the companionship she once imagined marriage would bring was never going to exist for her. Thomas's death in 1836 came swiftly and violently, a fall from a horse that broke his neck before anyone could reach him, and though society mourned him, Eleanor felt something far more complex than grief. She was 29, newly widowed, and for the first time in her life, she possessed a sliver of power that did not require a man's permission. South Carolina law granted her control of Ashwood Plantation until Jonathan came of age, meaning every agricultural decision, every financial choice, every aspect of daily life now answered to her alone. And with that authority came a clarity she had never dared exercise before. The first thing she did was fire the overseer, Cyrus Hook, a man infamous for equating productivity with brutality, a man whose whip cracked through Ashwood's nights with a rhythm Eleanor had forced herself to ignore while Thomas lived. Replacing him with a younger overseer, Samuel Pierce, she issued a quiet but firm directive: reduce the violence, not eliminate it, because the entire system of slavery made cruelty its backbone, but reduce it enough that she no longer heard screams drifting across the fields after dark. It was the smallest rebellion imaginable, yet for Eleanor it was the beginning of reclaiming a part of herself long buried under duty and silence. With the overseer replaced, Eleanor began walking Ashwood with new eyes, meeting the skilled workers Thomas had mostly ignored, except when demanding results. She spoke with the blacksmith, the carpenter, the cook, and the field hands who organized planting schedules, asking what they needed, what tools would improve their work, what systems frustrated them. It was unheard of for a white mistress to consult enslaved laborers as if their opinions held weight, yet Eleanor listened with a sincerity that startled everyone, herself included, and the plantation changed, not through fear, not through pain, but through the rare efficiency that comes when human beings are treated as something closer to people instead of machines. Productivity rose subtly each year, enough for observers to praise Eleanor's shrewd domestic sense, unaware that her quiet reforms were not clever management, but the earliest stirrings of her struggle with the very institution she still upheld every day. She remained firm, composed, outwardly proper, but inside something had begun to shift, a recognition that the order Thomas worshipped had always been built on blood, and that she could no longer pretend that ignoring it absolved her. And then came Marcus. Though he had been at Ashwood since childhood, purchased alongside his mother when he was 9, Eleanor had passed him countless times during her marriage without ever truly seeing him, because plantation life taught white women not to look too closely at the people whose forced labor sustained their comfort. But after Thomas's death, when a storm damaged the main house roof and Marcus supervised the repairs, Eleanor noticed him with unsettling clarity. His movements were precise, his instructions calm, his intelligence unmistakable in the way he explained not only what needed to be done, but why. When she asked a question, he answered without lowering his gaze to the ground, meeting her eyes with a quiet dignity that defied the script enslaved people were expected to follow. It was such a small thing, a simple exchange about structural repairs, yet it reoriented something inside her, an awareness, a curiosity, a recognition of a mind she had never been allowed to acknowledge before. From that moment, Eleanor found herself seeking his counsel more often, convincing herself it was simply good management even as she felt an unfamiliar pull, a dangerous thread weaving itself through the new life she was building at Ashwood. Marcus had arrived at Ashwood as a child, purchased from a Virginia estate when he was only 9, bundled into the ledgers beside his mother as if their lives held the same weight as farm equipment. His mother died when he was 15, leaving him alone in a world where loneliness was a sentence almost as brutal as any physical punishment. Yet Marcus survived by becoming invaluable, learning carpentry, blacksmithing, mechanical repair, and even literacy, a dangerous skill he guarded like a secret blade. The other enslaved workers trusted his judgment, and even Thomas Whitmore, who beat him more often than most, grudgingly relied on his intelligence. But it wasn't until the roof repairs after a violent storm that Eleanor truly saw him, not as item number 27, not as a laborer, but as a man whose presence altered the air around him. He directed 2 workers with calm authority, explaining the logic behind each step with a precision that made her realize she was speaking to someone capable of far more than the world allowed him to be. When she asked a question, he met her gaze without flinching, not defiant, not submissive, simply present, and the steadiness of his eyes unsettled her in a way she couldn't name. Their conversations began pragmatically, repairs, tools, schedules, but each exchange stretched longer, as if neither wished to be the first to step away. Eleanor started inviting him to review plans, discuss supplies, or examine structural problems. But beneath those practical excuses lived a growing hunger she refused to acknowledge. She told herself it was only curiosity, that Marcus's intelligence made him useful, that seeking his insight was simply good management. But she knew the truth in the quiet moments after he left the room, the flicker of anticipation before each meeting, the hollow ache on the days she didn't see him, the way her breath caught when he stepped through the doorway. And inside her mind a dark rationalization began to grow, whispered in a voice she wished she didn't recognize. I own him. So whatever happens is my decision. It was a thought born from the twisted logic of the world she inhabited, a weapon disguised as permission, and even as she despised herself for it, she clung to it as a shield against the forbidden desire she felt awakening. The first physical contact was almost nothing, almost accidental, a moment engineered by Eleanor with the precision of someone lying to herself. They were standing at her desk reviewing a survey map, their shoulders closer than decorum allowed, the tension in the room tightening with every breath. Eleanor reached across him to point at a marked section, letting her fingers brush against his arm just long enough to feel the heat of him beneath his shirt. Marcus went completely still, not recoiling, not advancing, simply frozen in a silence so sharp it felt like a blade pressed between them. Eleanor felt her pulse hammer against her ribs as she pulled her hand back, realizing she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Marcus stepped away with slow, careful control, continuing the conversation as if nothing had happened, though the rough edge in his voice betrayed how deeply the moment had affected him. She dismissed him early, her hands shaking long after the door closed, not in regret, but in the terrifying thrill of having touched something she knew she was never meant to reach. Their private meetings grew longer, discussions turning into confessions, questions turning into philosophies whispered beneath lamplight. Eleanor found herself asking Marcus how he learned to read, what he thought about the world beyond Ashwood, what purpose a life could hold when every choice was stolen by law. He answered with caution, but with a depth that made her realize he had been thinking these thoughts for years, thoughts that could get him killed if overheard by the wrong ears. And then one night, when Eleanor's grief spilled over after a field worker collapsed and died, Marcus crossed a line of his own by stepping into her study without being invited. She asked him, through tears, whether she had any right to grieve a man enslaved by her own system. Marcus held her gaze and said quietly, "Grief doesn't ask permission." When she pressed him on how he endured the impossibility of his life, he told her, "I choose what little I can. I choose not to let this place make me cruel." Eleanor moved toward him, trembling, and whispered, "Tell me to stop." Marcus tensed, his voice low and raw as he answered, "You know I can't. You own me." He explained the truth she already feared. Nothing between them could ever be equal. Nothing could ever be consensual, not while she possessed the legal power to destroy him with a word. And in that truth lived the peril that would define everything that followed, because Eleanor should have walked away. Instead, she kissed him, and he kissed her back, and the world they entered that night would haunt them both for the rest of their lives. Their secret relationship unfolded in the narrowest sliver of night, a fragile world carved out between darkness and dawn, where the rest of Ashwood slept unaware. Marcus began coming to Eleanor's study after midnight, always entering through the back corridor, always listening for footsteps with the instinctive vigilance of someone whose life depended on silence. They talked for hours. Books, ideas, the cruelty of the world they both inhabited but experienced so differently. And in those conversations, Eleanor felt a kind of intellectual companionship she'd never known, certainly never with Thomas. The intimacy grew not from touch at first, but from recognition, from the shock of discovering another mind capable of meeting hers rather than dismissing it. Yet the physical closeness followed inevitably, hands lingering a moment too long, shoulders brushing in tight spaces, breaths catching when their distance closed to a whisper. And eventually these late-night meetings became more than conversation, more than accidental touches. They became acts of longing, of desperation, of two people reaching for something neither had the right to claim. Every moment they spent together was forbidden, unthinkable, and dangerous, but neither stepped back. Yet beneath every kiss, every whispered confession, every trembling moment of pleasure, the truth rotted like a wound they refused to clean. Eleanor could tell herself she was different from other plantation mistresses, that she saw Marcus's humanity, that she reduced violence and cared about justice. But the moment she reached for him, she stepped directly into the same monstrous power structure she claimed to condemn. She could speak eloquently about morality and compassion, but she still held the legal authority to command Marcus, to punish him, to sell him, to destroy his life in an instant. She could pretend their relationship was mutual, but she knew the law would never see it that way. And neither, deep down, would Marcus. Even as she held him, even as she whispered apologies into his skin, she knew she was taking something he had no real ability to refuse. Her hypocrisy became a shadow that followed her everywhere, reminding her that whatever tenderness she felt existed inside a system of ownership she benefited from every day. Marcus carried his own torment, a quieter agony that settled into his bones no matter how close Eleanor drew him. He told himself that some part of this connection was real, that maybe he genuinely cared for her, but the truth ate at him. He was living a contradiction, betraying principles he had clung to his entire life just to survive with dignity and tact. Every time he returned to the quarters after leaving her bed, he felt the weight of the lie he was living, that he, who believed in freedom and self-respect, had allowed himself to fall into a relationship where he possessed neither. He knew other enslaved men had been destroyed for far less, and that he was taking a risk that could end not only his life, but the lives of those around him. He wrestled nightly with questions that had no answers, whether he chose Eleanor, or whether his choices were illusions crafted by fear and survival instinct, whether affection could be genuine when refusal could mean punishment, whether he was weak for wanting her or simply human. But no matter how deeply the guilt cut, he returned to her when she called, caught between danger and desire. And the most devastating truth was that neither of them stopped. They kept meeting in the stolen hours of night, building a world stitched together from longing, guilt, and silence. They clung to each other in a system designed to strip everyone of their humanity, but their closeness did not erase the darker reality. It magnified it. The secrecy, the trembling urgency, the whispered promises that both knew were impossible, all fed into the moral decay at the heart of their relationship. Eleanor felt alive in ways she hadn't since her youth, yet with every moment of passion she felt the weight of the power imbalance pressing harder against her conscience. Marcus felt connection, comfort, something dangerously close to love, but he also felt the truth that he could never escape. This was not equality, not freedom, not something born of choice. It was two people reaching for each other in a cage, each pretending the bars were not there. And as the years passed, the cage only tightened. Eleanor first sensed the truth in the quiet dread that settled over her body, a missed cycle, a wave of nausea, the unmistakable signs she had prayed would never come. When the realization struck fully, it felt like the room tilted beneath her feet, because there was no innocent explanation for a pregnancy arriving 5 years after her husband's death. She knew instantly what discovery would mean, not scandal, not whispers, but an investigation brutal enough to expose everything she had hidden. If the child bore even the faintest mark of African ancestry, the truth would scream from her features, and Marcus would be condemned without trial, torn apart by a mob before she could utter a word. Eleanor considered the unthinkable options, her mind drifting to remedies whispered among women who needed to solve such problems quietly, but something inside her resisted with a force she couldn't explain. Maybe it was longing, maybe guilt, maybe the twisted belief that this child could be a piece of a life she had never been allowed to choose. But whatever the reason, she made the most devastating decision of her life. She would carry the baby to term, knowing it might destroy them all. As her body changed, Eleanor retreated to Charleston under the guise of poor health, hiding behind loose dresses and shuttered windows, while fear gnawed at her every waking breath. Ruth was born on a humid May morning, a small, fragile girl whose pale skin almost convinced Eleanor she had been granted a miraculous reprieve. But in certain angles, in certain lights, the shape of her eyes and curve of her mouth betrayed the truth that Eleanor dreaded. Eleanor held her daughter for less than an hour, memorizing the warmth of her body, the softness of her breath, knowing she was absorbing something she would have to relinquish. Hannah, her trusted servant, carried the child to Ashwood with instructions to record her as the newborn daughter of Sarah, a woman who had died days earlier in childbirth. It was a story designed to fit neatly into the plantation's ledgers, backed by a display of charity that no one dared question, a benevolent mistress choosing to keep an orphaned infant rather than sell her. The world would accept the lie because it was convenient, because it preserved the illusion of order, because it kept the ugliest truths buried where society preferred them. Eleanor returned home weeks later and saw Ruth occasionally, a small girl toddling through the quarters, unaware that the distant white woman watching her was not her owner but her mother. Every glimpse struck Eleanor with a grief so sharp it felt physical, because she knew she had done something unforgivable. She had enslaved her own child to save herself, to protect Marcus, to preserve a secret she no longer believed deserved protection. The evil of the system she had propped up for years settled into her bones in a way she could no longer ignore. She had spent her life rationalizing, softening cruelty where she could, convincing herself that small kindnesses mattered, but none of those lies could survive the weight of what she had done to Ruth. In the privacy of her room, Eleanor wept for the life her daughter would live, for the mother she could not claim, for the freedom she had been denied before she could speak her own name. And in those moments, Eleanor felt the full monstrosity of her world and of herself bearing down on her. Marcus felt it too, though his grief took a quieter, more fractured form. When Eleanor told him about the pregnancy, he hid his fear behind measured words, but she could see the devastation in his eyes, the knowledge that their choices had created a life the law insisted he could never protect. After Ruth's birth, something inside him recoiled from Eleanor, as if touching her meant touching the decision that had condemned their daughter to bondage. He still came to her when summoned, still held her, still listened to her whispered guilt, but an invisible wall had risen between them, built from shame, helplessness, and the unbearable truth that they had crossed a line so monstrous there was no path back. Every night they spent together felt heavier, tainted by the presence of a child they could never acknowledge, and though their bodies still sought each other, their hearts moved through a fog of grief neither could dispel. They had tried to carve out a world of their own within the cage of slavery, but Ruth's existence proved the truth they had avoided. The cage was always stronger than their defiance, and now it had closed around all three of them forever. Jonathan grew into adulthood with a rigidity that disturbed Eleanor more with every passing year. Where she had softened, he hardened. Where she questioned the world, he clung to it with fierce conviction. He embraced the politics of Charleston's elite, speaking proudly of states' rights, racial hierarchy, and the natural order that placed white men at the top. He mimicked Thomas's sternness without the temper, adopting a calm, cold certainty that left no room for moral discomfort. But beneath that polished exterior lived a brewing suspicion. Jonathan watched Marcus more closely than was reasonable, noting every interaction, every conversation his mother had with the man she trusted more than anyone on the plantation. One evening, with an arrogant confidence he believed was maturity, Jonathan confronted her, saying, "Mother, your constant reliance on Marcus creates a dangerous perception. People are talking. Your favoritism undermines authority." Eleanor felt her blood run cold, because beneath Jonathan's words was not concern but threat. He intended to correct her errors when he inherited Ashwood, and she knew exactly what that correction would mean for Marcus. It was in that moment Eleanor understood the full danger of the life she had built in shadows. Jonathan's suspicions were unfocused now, but if he ever traced the truth back to Ruth's eyes or Marcus's presence, his reaction would be swift and merciless. Jonathan viewed the world through a lens sharpened by entitlement, cunning enough to sense impropriety, proud enough to defend the family's honor with violence, and calculating enough to see Marcus not as a man, but as a liability, a stain to be removed. Eleanor knew beyond any doubt that he would kill Marcus without remorse if he believed it necessary, and she saw with gut-wrenching clarity that he would sell Ruth instantly, wiping away the scandal before it touched him. This realization drove her to a decision more radical than anything she had ever dared. She contacted her attorney, William Prescott, summoning him to Ashwood under the guise of financial review, and once alone with him, she laid out her intentions in quiet, precise terms. Prescott listened with growing alarm as she explained she wished to alter her will, not to preserve the Whitmore legacy, but to dismantle Jonathan's future entirely. He warned her the legal consequences would be immense, the social consequences catastrophic, but Eleanor's resolve did not waver. She would use her death to protect the people her life had placed in danger. For months, Prescott drafted and redrafted a will unlike anything South Carolina law had ever seen, building legal scaffolds to hold up a structure that defied the racial order of the South. He constructed a trust to transfer Ashwood into Marcus's control, an arrangement hidden behind layers of property law that could bypass some of the scrutiny he knew would come. He inserted manumission clauses granting Marcus freedom the instant Eleanor died, ensuring he could not be reclaimed as property before the will took effect. He added provisions securing Ruth's freedom and financial support, creating a pathway for her to leave the plantation without drawing attention to the truth of her birth. And at Eleanor's insistence, he wrote Jonathan entirely out of the inheritance. No land, no money, no authority, nothing but shock awaiting him when the envelope was opened after her death. When Eleanor signed the final draft in March of 1850, her hand trembled not from fear, but from the weight of what she hoped this document might achieve. She knew Jonathan would contest it violently. She knew the courts might overturn it. She knew the world she lived in did not forgive women who defied it. But she also knew that if she did nothing, Marcus and Ruth would die or vanish into chains, and she would carry that guilt into eternity. And so she sealed the will, the most dangerous document a Southern woman had ever written, praying death would grant her the power life had denied. Eleanor's decline began as a cough so slight she dismissed it, but within days her lungs filled with fluid, and every breath felt like a debt she could no longer pay. The doctor spoke gently, the way men do when the truth is fatal. She had only days left. With death approaching, she summoned Marcus to her bedside, breaking every boundary of Southern propriety, dismissing the servant so only he remained in the dim, suffocating quiet of her room. Her voice trembled as she told him what she had done, revealing the will she had crafted in secret, the manumission, the trust, the inheritance of Ashwood, the protections for Ruth, the disinheritance of Jonathan. She expected shock, perhaps sorrow, perhaps even a flicker of relief, but instead the color drained from Marcus's face as if she had struck him. His silence stretched until it felt unbearable, and when he finally spoke, his voice cracked with something far sharper than gratitude. "You've sentenced me to death," he said, each word heavy enough to crush the air between them. Marcus stepped back from her bed, trembling with a rage so controlled it was more terrifying than shouting. He told her that a free black man inheriting a plantation in South Carolina was not a victory, it was an execution. He explained that mobs killed first and asked questions never, that the law might declare him free but the men who clung to power would destroy him before sunrise. "You think a piece of paper protects me," he whispered, "but all it does is paint a target on my back." Eleanor tried to reach for him, insisting she was trying to give him freedom, trying to correct the monstrousness of the life she had forced on him, but Marcus pulled his hand away as though her touch burned. He told her she had made the same mistake she always made, deciding for him, using her power without asking what danger she was placing on his shoulders. His final words cut through her like a blade. "I can't forgive you. I don't know if I ever could." He walked out of her room without looking back. 2 days later, Eleanor Whitmore died alone in a silent house. The daughter she could never claim, unaware that her mother had taken her last breath, and the man she loved unable to offer even the mercy of goodbye. When the will was finally read in William Prescott's office, the quiet formality of the moment shattered the instant Jonathan realized what his mother had done. He rose so violently his chair toppled behind him, shouting accusations of madness, manipulation, and corruption, as if each word might somehow rewrite the ink on the page. He claimed his mother had been insane, whispered that she had been seduced or coerced, insisting no sane white woman would leave her legacy to a man the law called property. Rumors of sexual impropriety filled the room like smoke, and Jonathan's humiliation curdled into rage so consuming he stormed out before Prescott could finish reading. Within hours he filed a legal challenge, setting in motion a court battle Charleston society devoured with morbid fascination. To them, this was not merely a will. It was an affront to the racial order, a threat to the hierarchy they relied upon, and a fear that if Eleanor's choice stood, it might reveal truths they preferred buried. The courtroom became a theater of Southern anxiety. Jonathan's attorneys argued diminished capacity, undue influence, and violation of public policy, painting Eleanor as a fragile woman manipulated by a cunning enslaved man who sought to overturn the natural order for his own gain. Prescott countered with letters, financial records, and testimony proving Eleanor's clarity of mind, her meticulous management, and her rational dissatisfaction with her son's values. But the real turning point came when Prescott called Marcus to the stand, an unprecedented move in a case involving a white estate. The courtroom bristled with hostility as Marcus took his seat, and Jonathan's lawyer wasted no time in attacking his character, demanding to know whether he had been intimate with Eleanor, whether he believed he deserved ownership of a plantation, whether he thought himself equal to white men. Marcus refused to answer questions crafted to provoke violence, but when asked whether he believed he could bear the responsibilities Eleanor entrusted to him, he delivered the line that made Charleston gasp. "The question you're really asking is whether someone like me can be trusted with power, and the answer that terrifies you is that maybe I can." The room erupted so violently the judge was forced to recess. Judge Warrington's ruling arrived months later, offering a compromise that satisfied no one yet revealed the lengths to which the court would go to preserve the social order. He upheld the manumission clauses, granting Marcus and Ruth their freedom, along with monetary bequests intended to help them build new lives. But he refused to grant Marcus control of Ashwood, ordering instead that the plantation be sold, its profits divided, 60% to Jonathan, 40% into a trust for the gradual emancipation and support of Ashwood's enslaved people. Marcus would live, but far from South Carolina, and far from the inheritance Eleanor believed might correct part of the harm she had done. Marcus took Ruth and moved north to Philadelphia, where he opened a modest carpentry shop and raised her safely away from the violence that had shaped his life. Years later, as an old man, he wrote a memoir, wrestling with the impossible contradictions of loving a woman who owned him and trying to understand whether redemption could ever be born from a relationship built on power and silence. As for Eleanor's legacy, history offers no clean verdict. Was she a victim of the world that shaped her, or an architect of her own moral corruption? Did she love Marcus, or did she mistake possession for affection? Could love exist at all when refusal was never an option? Her final act freed 2 lives, yet chained them first, and the weight of that contradiction sits uneasily on anyone who tries to judge her. Maybe she was both villain and victim, both monstrous and sincere, both a product of her time and a breaker of its boundaries. But one truth remains. Her attempt at redemption came too late to save her, too late to protect her family, and too flawed to offer absolution. Yet even in its failure, it exposed the twisted heart of a system built on ownership, desire, and fear, and that truth, however painful, deserve to be dragged into the light. If this story shook you, unsettled you, or made you question the histories we think we understand, make sure you're subscribed to Noctivox Dark Stories, like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and tell me, was Eleanor seeking redemption or merely rewriting her guilt? Because here in the dark we confront the past honestly, no matter how deep the shadows go.